It happened 4,000 years ago. 2,000 years before the birth of Christ. 4,000 years ago, God called a semi-nomadic shepherd to be the father of the Hebrew people. That man was Abram. 4,000 years ago, God called Abram to be the father of the Hebrew nation. And Abram accepted. And he got all his belongings together and his family together, and he headed into the land of Canaan. And he hadn't gotten far into the land of Canaan until he pitched his tent, Genesis says, and built an altar. He built an altar at Shechem. And at that altar, Abram worshiped God and gave thanks to God. He packed up his family. They headed farther into the land of Canaan. And once again, he stopped, pitched his tent, this time at Bethel, and he built an altar. And at that altar, Abram worshiped God and gave thanks to God. From the earliest moments of our journey as the Judeo-Christian faith, worship has been at the heart of who we are. Let me say it again. From our earliest moments on this journey of being the Judeo-Christian faith, worship has been at the core of who we are as God's people. So let's talk about worship this morning, about what it can be and what it should be. Let me share some insights. First of all, we come here to glorify God. In worship, we come to glorify God. One of my favorite anecdotal stories that I've told before is about the minister who called all the children forth for the children's time, just like Lisa did this morning. And once all the children were gathered here at the altar rail, he held up a picture of a frog, and he said to the children, "What does this picture make you think of?" Well, immediately one little boy shot up his hand and said, "God." Well, that took the minister a little aback, and he said, okay, can you tell me why this picture of a frog makes you think about God? And the little boy said, "Well, I knew you didn't bring us all the way down here to talk about frogs." I like that kid. It's about God. Worship is first and foremost and fundamentally about God. It's not about you, and it's not about me. First and foremost, it's about God. It's about glorifying God, about listening to God, and about affirming that God is worthy of our time, our effort, and our praise. That's why I love what the psalmist said here in the 95th Psalm, when he reminded us that God is first and foremost in our lives. He said, "Let us come before him with thanksgiving and extol him with music and song. For the Lord is the great God, the great King above all gods. Come, let us bow down and worship. Let us kneel before the Lord our Maker, for he is our God. And we are the people of his pasture, the flock under his care." First of all, worship is about glorifying God. Secondly, we come here to be renewed, to be refueled, to find power in the Spirit. Somebody has said that on any given Sunday morning, in any church of any denomination, there will be two things that are true of every person in the sanctuary. In any sanctuary, on any Sunday, of any church, of any denomination, this person says there will be two things that are true about you and two things that are true about me. First of all, that we come bruised. Life is tough, this person says. You come this morning, one way or the other, bruised by life. It may be economic. It may be relational. It may be some issue at work. It may be some issue in the family. You may be facing some crisis in your life, but the fact is, this person says, every Sunday morning in every sanctuary of every church, of every denomination, every person comes with some bruising. And he says, secondly, we come harried and hurried. We come overwhelmed. We've got our task and our responsibilities, our expectations, all those things on our plate, and we come loaded down. And so he says that every worship service, you and I come bruised and you and I come overwhelmed. And so we need a time We need a place. We need a moment. We need a sanctuary where we can be renewed and refilled. Luke says that when Jesus returned to Nazareth as he began his public ministry, that he went to church, that he went to the temple, as was his custom, as he did routinely. Routinely, Jesus went to church. And I'm convinced that Jesus went to church because with you and me, he wanted to glorify God. But I also think that Jesus, just like you and me, needed some times of renewal. Sometimes to reconnect with God. He needed a sanctuary, a time, a place where he could come apart from the rush and pull and pain of it all to be renewed. Remember how Richard Blanchard put it in that wonderful song? Fill my cup, Lord. I lift it up, Lord. Come and quench this thirsting of my soul. Bread of heaven, feed me till I want no more. Fill my cup, fill it up, and make me whole. I believe that in worship, you and I get our cups refilled. Now, the third thing about worship is we come here to experience God personally. Each of us comes here in worship to experience God personally. Now, this gives me a chance to say some things about styles of worship. So I want you to listen carefully. First of all, the style of worship doesn't matter to God. As long as he is glorified, as long as Jesus is lifted up, the style of worship does not matter to God. I want you to hear that. As long as he is glorified, as long as Jesus is lifted up, the style of worship doesn't matter to God. Now, here's the way I wrote and summed that up. From high church to evangelical and lively, from stately organs to contemporary instruments of praise, from David dancing and the trumpet blowing in 2 Samuel to the first offering of Handel's Messiah in 1742, from the Catholic and Anglican traditions to the lively songs of Charles Wesley, we have glorified God, we have lifted up Jesus, and we have been empowered in the faith. From the magnificent organ to contemporary praise music, from informal services to more formal services, in environments that are clearly traditional to environments that are more relaxed, we have shown that God can be glorified and Jesus can be lifted up. So listen to me carefully. The style of worship doesn't matter to God. As long as, again, he's glorified and Jesus is lifted up. But having said that, it matters to us individually. You know, we're all different. We're all different emotionally, mentally, physically. We all connect with God in different ways. We all need a particular way of expressing our worship of God and his connection with us. The fact is that some people cannot worship outside of traditional worship, and the fact is some people cannot worship meaningfully outside of more contemporary worship. And all that says is that God made us different, right? We're not the same. What speaks to you may not speak to me, and what speaks to me may not speak to you. And how you connect with God may not be the way I connect with God, and how I connect with God may not be the way that you connect with God. And so the beauty of what we're doing with our ancient modern service at this time, when we launch it later in the fall, is we're trying to acknowledge that people connect with God in different ways. And we want to be sure at Germantown Church that we do everything we can to help you individually and personally connect with God the way that you connect with God. All the while glorifying him and lifting up Jesus. The fourth thing about worship is here we receive our marching orders. We don't receive our marching orders from Goldman Sachs. We don't receive our marching orders from the Wall Street Journal. We don't receive our marching orders from the Republican Party or the Democratic Party. We don't receive our marching orders from special interest groups. We don't receive our marching orders from those who can shout the loudest or protest the deepest. We receive our marching orders from one place. That is the person, the life, the witness, the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth. I want every worship service here at Germantown Church to be a time and a place that you're reminded and I'm reminded who gives us our marching orders. It's not the world. It's Jesus of Nazareth. I mentioned a few weeks ago the book by Andy Stanley titled Christian. It's not what you think. And in that book, he differentiates between the word Christian and the word disciple. And Andy Stanley says that the word Christian is about a belief, whereas the word disciple is about an action. You believe the right things, you might be called a Christian, but you're not a disciple of Jesus unless you seek to do what Jesus says. And he goes on to say that the core definition of a disciple is saying yes to Jesus. What does it mean to be a disciple? We seek to say yes to Jesus. To say yes to loving the unlovable. To say yes to forgiving those who've wronged us. To say yes to sharing our resources with those who are less fortunate than we are. To say yes to living gently and humbly and compassionately and caringly. I don't care who else is telling you how to live or what to do. Here, in this place, in this time called worship, we're reminded there's one voice, one authority, one leader, one master, one person who gives us our marching orders, and that's Jesus of Nazareth. And finally, I would say, in worship, we find seeds of hope. In worship, we find seeds of hope. I don't know if you realize it or not, if you noticed it, but this past Friday, was the 9th anniversary of Hurricane Katrina. In 2005, Hurricane Katrina, Category 5, struck the Gulf Coast, devastating, as you so well know, portions of Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama. Let me remind you that was the worst natural disaster in U.S. history, that 1,300 people died, that tens of thousands found themselves homeless within a matter of hours, that 1 million people were displaced, that 400,000 people lost their jobs, that it cost $150 billion in damage. Hurricane Katrina. I was pastoring, as most of you know at that time, in Murray, Kentucky. First United Methodist Church in Murray. We received into the Murray community over 200 evacuees primarily from Louisiana. They were on buses. They came on the buses into our community, and they had nothing. We watched them get off the buses as they came into our community, and we sought as faith communities to connect with them and help them. We watched them get off the buses with simply a bag or two and nothing else. The clothes on their backs and a bag or two. They had nothing. And so we churches, we faith communities, reached out to these families and sought to bring them under our care. And First Methodist of Murray had the privilege of working with 3 or 4 families. And one of them was a family that had a father, a mother, a grandmother, a teenage son, and an elementary age girl. And they got off the bus with nothing. And we connected with them. They started coming to our church. And after several weeks, I received one of the most meaningful notes I've ever received from anyone in over 40 years of ministry. The father wrote me these words. My family needs to be in church. We need to be reminded weekly that there is something the waters cannot wash away, something that the winds cannot destroy, something that the storms cannot overwhelm, something that can sustain us when everything else is lost. We need to come here to remember that God is still God and He is with us. We need this weekly anchor in our lives now more than ever. So here's this father who got off that bus with nothing with his family, is being relocated, at least for a while, in Murray, Kentucky, and he writes me a note saying, oh, how we need Sunday morning worship. To know there's something the floodwaters can't wash away. There's something the most devastating in life, storms in life cannot destroy. There's something that can sustain us in the deepest recesses of our souls. God is still God. Whatever is going on out there, we are reminded here, God is still God. And He is with us. So from the earliest moments of our rich journey as the Judeo-Christian religion, from Abraham on, we have worshiped. We've come to glorify God. We've come week after week to be renewed, refilled, restored. We've come to personally connect with God in a way that works for us. We've come to get our marching orders, to hear the Master. And we've come to be reminded God is still God. And thanks be to God.